we're going to be taking a look at the book of Galatians. But more specifically than just the book of Galatians, we want to talk about the Apostle Paul. The sermon title this morning on our Twitter board out there, our own personal Twitter board, is a letter from the Apostle Paul to the churches of Burbank. And that really is how we need to think about the letters of Paul. Grab that Bible in front of you for just a second. If you're at home, grab your Bible and take a look at it. I want you to turn over to page, in the blue Bible that we have here, turn over to page 184. So the way that this Bible in our pews is set apart, or organized rather, is it goes from one to whatever for the Old Testament and then one from whatever to the New Testament. But turn into page 184. And what book of the Bible is there? Romans, exactly. Now, keep your finger there and flip over to page 264. 184 to 264. Got it? And what book of the Bible is there? But what's above it? Philemon. Philemon. So from Romans to Philemon, 13 books of the Bible, or more to be precise, 13 letters in the Bible. That's how many letters you are holding between your fingers there. From Romans to Philemon. Do you all know how many books are in the Bible, in the New Testament? 39. What? Huh? 27. Okay? 27 books in the New Testament. Okay? 39 books in the Old Testament. By the way, you know how you remember that? How many letters in the word old? How many letters in the word testament? 9. 39. Okay? How many letters in the word new? How many letters in the word testament? So, 3 times 9 is... New, yes, exactly. Precisely. So the Apostle Paul wrote 13 letters that we have out of the 27 documents that are in the New Testament. So obviously, the church leaned pretty heavily on the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul, if you remember, so much of what we dealt with when we were looking at the book of Acts last year, and for I think we stayed in the book of Acts for 10 years, isn't that about right? The Apostle Paul was a major player within the book of Acts. And so what we want to do for the next few weeks here is we want to take a look at some of the letters that Paul has written that are his shorter letters, if you will. So we're going to take a look at letters like Galatians and Ephesians and Philippians and Colossians. By the way, you know how you can remember that? God eats peaches and cream. General Electric Power Company. Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. So if you can kind of grab hold of some of those little mnemonic devices to help you learn where some of these things are, it's a little easier to find some of the stuff that's there. Okay? Paul's letter to the church in Galatia is the first of those. So take your finger out of 184 and flip over to Galatians, and I don't know what page that's on, but just flip over there for a second. Galatia is not like Burbank. Galatia is not like Westminster. Galatia is more like Southern California. Galatia is like Northern California, or it's a region as opposed to a city, an area, and it is the more like that whole idea of less like Rome, for example, or the churches of the Revelation, and more like a general area that Paul's writing to. So this letter would have been written by Paul. Paul then had it disseminated around the region, and people would have taken that letter and they would have recopied it, and they would have gleaned information from it. Now, there's a great little a snippet from Peanuts, the cartoon Peanuts, which, it seems so old, Peanuts, doesn't it? But there are some wonderful little bon mots within it. At one point, Linus is talking about the fact that he's studying the letters of Paul in Sunday school, and he always feels guilty because he's reading somebody else's mail. But that's what we're doing here. If they stumbled across one of your letters to a friend and read it thousands of years from now, there would be things that you would have to know about you and about the person that you're writing it to and such. And that's why we do research on this. It's why we try to figure out what's going on, why the letter was being written at that particular time, what were the circumstances, who was it written to, what were their circumstances. And we need to know all of that before we go into it. And to find that out, one of the things that we need to do is we need to say, well, what is really the theme verse of all of this? Flip over to Galatians chapter 5, verse 1. Page 232. Galatians 5:1 says this: Christ has set us free to live what? A free life. Christ has set us free to live a free life. So take your stand. Never again let someone place you under a yoke of slavery. That is the theme verse of Galatians, which Josh Clairville has illustrated very nicely today in our slide. Everybody say thank you, Josh. Thank you, Josh. Did a great job. Good job. Christ has set us free to live a free life. So take your stand. Never again let someone put you in a yoke of slavery. So Galatians is about living a free life. Galatians is about freedom. Or, as Mel Gibson would say, it's about freedom! But the freedom and the foundation of freedom that Paul is talking about is different than the political freedom that we would say, the land of the free and the home of the play ball, or a social freedom that I might have, a social freedom where I say I am allowed to do certain things, or I'm constrained from doing certain things. It is different from that because the freedom of which Paul writes comes at a cost. As I said in the confession, there is a privilege within it, but there is also a responsibility of it. So the way that it plays out here, remember I said one of the things that we need to do is, as we're reading a letter of Paul or reading any of the letters, what we need to do is we need to know what is the context. And the context is this: sometime in the life of the Galatian congregations, some people began to teach that Gentile Christians, in other words, people who had become Christians without first becoming Jews, needed to become Jews before they could become followers of Christ. Now, we talked about this a little bit when we were dealing with the book of Acts, but so do you remember what we called those people, what Bible scholars call these people? Probably not. It's a word that you probably don't use very often. Judaizers. Okay? The Judaizers were a group of people who believed that in order for a non-Jew to become a Christian, they had to first become Jews and then become Christians. So they had to go through the whole process of becoming a proselyte within the Jewish faith. This was something that infuriated the Apostle Paul. Absolutely infuriated him. In fact, he refers to it in Galatians 1, 6, and 7 as a perversion of the gospel of Christ. He saw these people as false teachers. He saw them as jeopardizing the salvation of those who accepted their teaching. And typically, when Paul writes a letter to a particular church, I spend some time over the next few weeks looking through the first few words of Paul's letters, from Romans all the way to Philemon. And one of the things typically, as you'll find, is he will open his letter with a warm greeting. Galatians, not so much. I mean, he starts, with it. He's got kind of an interesting little opening sentence here. He says, Paul, an apostle, sent neither by human commission or from human authorities, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead, and to all the members of God's family who are with me, to the churches of Galatia, grace and peace from God our Father and Lord Jesus Christ, so on and so forth. And then he says what I said in the confession. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. So right out of the gates, good manners kind of go across, and he says, I am astonished that you are doing this. I am astonished that you are having this kind of feeling and subversion. Paul's talking about the gospel being subverted. The gospel being transformed from truth into something that is not truth. And the intricacies of the words that he uses here, I won't get into it at this point, but basically he's talking about that idea of subverting and perverting. Subverting and perverting, or transforming something from what it is to what it isn't. An opposite character. A subverted gospel, then, is not something of truth. A subverted gospel is something that we can't stand on. We can't put our weight down on it. We can't trust it. And there is what Paul is struggling with. The gospel needs to be truth. We have to look at the entire gospel. But articulated truth, the truth that we might speak about, is only part of the story. Truth also has to be lived out by us. And that's why I said that the gospel or freedom comes with privilege, but it also comes with responsibility. And that's something that Paul owns. In verse 13, chapter 1, verse 13, he says this. You have heard, no doubt, about my early life, how I was violently persecuting the church of God and was trying to destroy it. I advanced in Judaism beyond many people in the same age, for I was more zealous for the traditions of my ancestors. So Paul's going to tell us a little bit about himself within these letters. And beginning with the arrest, the stoning of Stephen, in Acts chapter 6, and continuing on through Acts chapter 8, Paul, who was then called what? Saul, which is probably the Jewish name, Paul being his Greek name, was an inspector javert to the burgeoning Christians. I looked around Jay to find a picture. Where'd Jay go? Jay's not here. I looked around to find a picture of Jay because he played Inspector Javert in one of our Oscar shows and did a wonderful job at it, by the way.
Inspector Javert.
Now, for Paul, this was no idle identification because Paul, as Saul, had been the strong arm of a rising persecution against the early church. He entered people's homes with warrants and dragged them off, those people who were believers. He threw them into prison. He, we are told, breathed murderous threats. How'd you like to say, how you doing today, Bob? Well, I'm breathing murderous threats. That's Paul. That's what he was doing. Now, ironically, in Galatia, Paul comes face to face with what he was. Paul comes face to face with Saul. In Les Miserables, Victor Hugo wrote the character of Javert for a purpose. He was quoted at one point saying, I wrote the character of Javert to confront our conscience, to be the ever-lurking presence of the law and our own condemnation. The tension between who we were and who we are, who we can be. That was the purpose for Victor Hugo of writing Javert. And Javert has become an archetype for many, many characters within modern culture. Remember the Fugitive TV show, Dr. Richard Kimball. He was running from Javert, right? All throughout that. And you find that on a regular point. The Javert characters in history and in myth basically represent that inescapable, shameful past that forever haunts and pursues our conscience. They are people of the law after the way of Javert, and the law in their eyes has no surprises. The law has a principle of retribution, and that is all it is based upon. It is simple, and it is monotonous. It is closed to all alternatives. It is shut up against any divine or human intervention. Javert represents the merciless application of the law. Justice is blind, and that's all that matters. Did you break the law? Then you are going to be guilty, and you are going to be thrown in prison. But that's not the gospel, is it? That's not at all what the gospel intimates. Javert isn't freedom. Javert is the opposite of freedom. And the gospel speaks of freedom. So Paul's metamorphosis from Javert to the man who wrote nearly 3/4 of the New Testament is an amazing grace story born of a strong understanding of Christ and the freedom he offers. You see, Paul recognizes that Jesus did it. Did what? Paid it all. Jesus paid it all. The law, he will say, has changed from becoming what he calls a pedagogos. Everybody say pedagogos. The idea of an old and trusted servant who will take us from home to school. That was the relationship, the responsibility of the pedagogos. Somebody that we loved, somebody we trusted, but now somebody whose only role is to take us from home to school. The law has become that. An old and trusted servant that we don't throw away, but what we do is we let that person lead us. And he recognizes that this is now who he is. And that is how we receive our freedom. Not by throwing out the law, but by seeing the law as God intended it, as a boundary. Years ago now, my eldest son was walking down one of the streets in Burbank, and he got to the edge of the street, and as he stepped off the street, the light began to change, and so he stepped back. But a police officer was sitting there, who was a Javert police officer, pulled over and called for backup. I know, right? Well, he was a kid, and they wanted to prove a point, and they wanted to scare him a little bit. And from that, developed within my son a dislike of police officers. Right? That's where that comes from. All he did was just step off the curb for a second and step back in, but they wanted to prove a point. Now, you and I all know police officers who are absolutely wonderful people, don't we? Oh, yeah. We have one in this community here that I think is one of my best friends. I love him dearly, Eric Rossoff. He is not a Javert police officer. He is an Apostle Paul police officer. Now he's kind of old, Eric. I'm sorry. You're watching this on live stream. So he's more of a pedagogos is what he is. But the thing is that those type of people see the law as a boundary of grace. They see it as a way of being understanding grace. That grace is not anything, but it is channeling us into the best life possible that God has called us to live. So Paul, who was Javert, was no longer a Javert, not to put too fine a point on it, but Paul had become Mr. Rogers. Stay with me for a second. You all know Mr. Rogers, right? Fred Rogers, right? I mean, we all know. For 892 episodes, from 1968 to 2001, Mr. Rogers' neighborhood of make-believe came alive within our living rooms. Now, I was right outside of the whole Mr. Rogers' neighborhood era. I was way too old to watch Mr. Rogers when he first premiered. So I became a fan of Mr. Rogers from, the other things. The wonderful movie that Tom Hanks did, or the idea of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood that Eddie Murphy did on Saturday Night Live. Any of those kind of things. But Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was, it seems really dated right now, especially in our attack-based society. But maybe we need somebody like Mr. Rogers, a gentle, love more, snark less kind of a guy. But there's a thing about Mr. Rogers that was very Fred Rogers-y. He was also a perfectionist. He would not allow a shoddy show. Fred Rogers believed that children were thoughtful people who deserved programming as good as anything that was produced for adults. And that's what he strived to do. You could disagree with what he did or how he did it, or think it was just a little too wonderful, too nice. But that was not, you got to understand that he saw that as doing something that was of good street cred. And like Paul, he knew the truth, and he was willing to gracefully stand in it. Most children's shows of that era shied away from the kind of important things that we talk about today. Death, competition, divorce, war. Fred Rogers never did. He would often talk about anger. And he would often focus on the peaceful ways that we can deal with angry people. Kind of need that today, don't we? He would always focus on the truth. He would always tell children the truth. He knew the power of truth. Now, unlike Paul, Fred Rogers was never an Inspector Javert. Years ago now, a rumor went around that Fred Rogers was a Navy SEAL or a Marine sniper. No, he wasn't. Those are just rumors. But there is something essential about Fred Rogers that connects him to Paul and the churches of Galatia. In his letter to the Philippians, the Apostle Paul gives his bona fides. And though they are arcane to us, that he was circumcised on the 8th day, that he was a member of the house of Israel, that he was of the tribe of Benjamin, and some of those things, we don't really get what those things mean, and we could talk about those another time if you want. But just know that when Paul lists all his bona fides, they are impressive. Fred Rogers could have done the same thing. Fred Rogers was a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He had 40 honorary degrees. He was a Peabody Award winner. He was an inductee into the Television Hall of Fame. He had about him 2 congressional resolutions, in a good way. He was ranked number 35 of TV Guide's 50th greatest TV stars of all time. He had many buildings and artwork directed to him, and his sweater, his Mr. Rogers sweater, of which I have been accused of looking like Mr. Rogers when I wear this. You know where that is? Smithsonian Institution, where it is labeled as a treasure of American history. Fred Rogers was a virtuoso on the piano. He started playing the piano at 5 years old. He was a private pilot. And at the time of his death, in February of 2003 from stomach cancer, he and his wife Sarah had been married more than 50 years. He didn't smoke, he didn't drink, but let's not hold that against him. He became a vegetarian in his mid-40s on ethical grounds, stating, "I don't want to eat anything that has a mother." Okay. But for all his seeming calm, boring demeanor, Fred Rogers squeezed an awful lot of life into his 75 years. But while those things don't necessarily align him with the churches in Galatia, there is something that does. Something that for all of his nerdiness should make him one of our heroes. Because Fred Rogers was an ordained Presbyterian minister. Now, what does that mean? It means that he went through the same things that Adam and I went through in order to do what we do. Fred Rogers graduated from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. And that means that he spent 3 years achieving a postgraduate degree in church history, church theology, languages, and counseling. That means he came under the care of a group of men and women who walked him through his sense of call, who helped him understand what it means to live a life of law and grace, who dealt with him in the difficult issues of life and celebrated with him in the goodness of life. They helped him understand and put hands and feet to his theology. That means he spent time with Christ and Christ's people. He sat in pews just like us. He stood in front of groups of people and preached. In other words, he was a part of the community of Christ that we refer to as the church. Big C church, or what we refer to in the Apostles' Creed as the Holy Catholic Church, a word which means universal. That is where we are today. And it's how we understand the difference between law and grace, the application of law within grace. Because it doesn't become something that's ethereal. It's not something that's out there. It's something that's right here, right now. It's something in which you and I, as a people of God, know exactly how we're supposed to act and know exactly what we're supposed to do and know exactly how other people are supposed to act and know exactly how other people are supposed to do. And then we walk into this room and our expectations are charged. They're changed. All of a sudden we look around and we go, but what's that person doing there? Why is that guy up in front of everybody talking about him, about God? Why is that person here and why is that person there? The reason for that is because the Church of Jesus Christ isn't, hopefully, at its best anyway, a manifestation of gospel freedom. The Church of Jesus Christ is a place of confrontation. The Church of Jesus Christ is where we are confronted with our sin and the sin of others. The Church of Jesus Christ is a place where we get to learn that the law has been fulfilled and that we are free, and that doesn't just mean me, that means you. That means each and every one of us. That is the blessing that we have. We may never know what it is that makes one person an Inspector Javert and another Mr. Rogers. One person a Saul and another person an Apostle Paul. We may never know what that is. But we do know what makes them change from one to the other. Paul told us at the outset. He told us that it wasn't political or social freedom that we were after, but freedom implemented by Jesus Christ. And the freedom that Christ implemented for you and for me is freedom that was bought on a cross. A freedom that came through a death where you and I have the opportunity to find out what true freedom is about. Freedom that comes with great privilege. I am a child of God. That is who I am. But it also comes with great responsibility. Because my responsibility now is to live that out in front of you. And you have a great privilege and responsibility as well. To live that out in front of each other, in front of me, in front of the people who watch you drive, in front of the people who watch what you spend your money on, or how you treat other people or how you treat children. Jesus, when asked the question, what is the greatest commandment, said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. A statement based upon the law. And the second greatest law, he said, is just like it. Say it with me. To love your neighbor as yourself.